New developments in military technology appear all the time, affecting warfare either in minute or dramatic ways, sending huge ripples throughout the battlefield. Among these are unmanned aerial vehicles, otherwise known as
unmanned drones. Drones.
Since the early 2000s, the US government has deployed drones throughout the Middle East in the country's war on terror, and has caught the attention of the world. As opposed to solving the problem of terrorism in this region, many are blaming drones for worsening the conflicts in already unstable states like Yemen, Somalia, and rural Pakistan. An overview of the data from drone strikes and their effect on public opinion leads to a frightening conclusion. These critics may be right. Many point fingers at drones when discussing the recruitment efforts and growth of terrorist organizations abroad. Notably, extremist groups spread to avoid drone attacks and take advantage of local opinion against drones to fuel their growth. While drone strikes may function perfectly to take out targets linked to terror activity, they cannot simply destroy the ideologies associated with it. This allows for these dangerous beliefs to be seeded in unstable areas throughout the world as terrorists branch into other regions, such as Nigeria, Yemen, and Somalia, in search of new sanctuaries away from drone strikes. Extremist groups, such as Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, sprouted from early ties to Al-Qaeda and are responsible for escalated terrorist activity in North Africa in the wake of drone attacks on former Al-Qaeda strongholds. The fact that radical organizations are able to garner support wherever they roam begs the question as to why civilians in drone-afflicted nations seek membership into these groups. Evidence shows that local populations may give greater support to terrorist groups due to the contribution of drones to civilian casualties and to the instability of local governments. It should come as no surprise that some who live in countries targeted by U.S. drone strikes grow to despise the country responsible for the deaths of their innocent peers. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism has found that a growing movement is occurring in Yemen as locals sympathize with the causes fought for by Islamic militants, following the deaths of up to 300 civilians in drone strikes. While these attacks do kill Islamic militants, they also inadvertently catch the innocent in their crossfire, thus fueling the flames of anti-American sentiment that pushes citizens to support terrorist activity against the U.S. and their own governments. Local groups from drone strike areas are not the only ones outraged. The unpopularity of the American drone program smears the reputation of the United States abroad among both allies and enemies, thanks in part to the questionable legality of the drones. The abuse of power and lack of responsibility by the American administration has fostered a vocal opposition. Particularly, critics note the use of drones outside of war zones and a failure of accountability over reprehensible actions. United Nations Rapporteur Christoph Heinz states that today's precedence for drone use ignores laws set in place since World War II to limit weapon use to areas of armed conflict only. Current targeted killings outside of these regions are completely extrajudicial and set the tone for other drone-harboring nations to ignore the United Nations legislation too. Should this trend continue with other states that develop drone technology, the fabric of order created by this law to ensure the stability of peace throughout the world will begin to tear. Ultimately, the largest failure of America's current drone campaign is that it simply doesn't solve any problems. Drone strikes are used in counterterrorism measures, yet fail to resolve core issues responsible for fostering extremist attitudes, such as economic and political disenfranchisement. To fully understand why drones do not contribute to solving the crisis of terrorism in the Middle East, one must first understand what causes terrorism. Conditions of socioeconomic and political inequality are ubiquitous in places where terrorism appears. Drones only throw salt on the metaphorical wounds of nations dealing with extremism by maintaining these circumstances. They exacerbate the problems existing between politically alienated local tribal groups and their ineffective governments by holding off social reforms that aim at reconciliation and long-term civilian assistance, while putting power in the hands of the military, not the people. If drones are not the answer to fighting terrorism, then other options must be sought out. In order to tackle unemployment and introduce job skills to the disenfranchised, adult education and literacy and other areas could allow for those suffering from financial inequality to learn to build and participate in political and economic institutions. The immediate results of giving adults the skills they need to function in the modern world would be evident in the growing skilled workforce and renewed economies of previously poverty-stricken states, who would be more capable of pursuing progressive projects thanks to newfound knowledge and wealth. Putting political and economic power back in the hands of the people of countries afflicted by extremism, by educating them and listening to their concerns, is a promising counterterrorism measure that the United States could use in place of their ineffective drones. As opposed to pursuing counterterrorism tactics with drones, the U.S. should focus on nonviolent measures, which may prove far more effective at addressing the problem of Islamic radicalism. The war on terror should not be a conventional war, but an ideological one. Rather than resorting to drones to simply kill those linked to terror groups, the U.S. should place emphasis on helping those in afflicted states with education and skill building, in addition to rekindling the connections between local governments and their citizens. If the disenfranchised of these nations could be given the incentive to strive toward the same ideals of democracy and progression that built America, then terrorism in the Middle East may finally